Welcome. Welcome to Tiny Desk Worship for the First Church and Parish in Dedham. Today is Sunday, January 17th, 2021, and we're worshiping now in my office at the Parish Hall for a change. We'll begin with our centering thought. If we talk about the environment, for example, we have to talk about environmental racism, about the fact that kids in central South Los Angeles have a third the lung capacity of the kids in Santa Monica. That's a quote by Danny Glover. We will begin with Plaint by Beatrice McGowan Scott, played by Derry Dolezal. It's so good to be together. Today we are worshiping in Zoom for the first time. I said I would start in February, but instead I started today. So if you didn't join us today, please know that next week, if you want to join us, you can start at 9:45 and visit with your fellow parishioners for 15 minutes before worship on Zoom, and then worship together, watching the service together at 10 o'clock. And then starting social hour right after that. I made this change so that those of you who prefer the worship experience with their friends and don't want to just asynchronously worship would have a better experience. But if you still prefer asynchronous worship, continue to go to our website or look at the email at 10 a.m. And anytime after that, you can watch our service. There are all kinds of opportunities to get together. We had our first writers workshop last week and it was a lot of fun. If you have any interest at all in writing or in listening to other people's poetry and prose, please join us, not this week, but next week on Thursday, a week from this Thursday. And the link is also on our website. So please watch all of our events and please join us when you can. We really miss getting together in person. We will now begin our morning worship with Keepers of the Earth by Joyce Poley, sung by our First Church Choir.
We are all as
are Rings of Fire 2016 by Craig Santos Perez. Honolulu, Hawaii. We host a small family party to celebrate my daughter's second birthday. This year is the hottest in history, breaking the record set when she was born. Still, I grill meat over charcoal and watch smoke crawl through the air like spirits of sacrificial animals. Still, I crave a cigarette, even after quitting 5 years ago, even after my clothes no longer smell like Grandpa's tobacco. His oxygen tank still scratches the tiled floor of memory and denial. My dad joins me outside and says, "Son, when I die, scatter my ashes in the ocean, far from this heat." Inside, my mom is cooking rice and steaming vegetables. They've traveled from California, where millions of trees have become tinder after years of drought, fueling catastrophe. When my daughter's body's fire-hosted fever, the doctor said it's a sign she's fighting infection. Volcanoes erupt along fault lines and disrupt flight patterns. Massive flames force thousands to evacuate tar sands. Oil country. When we can't control fire, we name it wild and pray to God for rain. When we can't control God, we name it war and pray to the votives for peace. If her fever doesn't break, the doctor said, take her to the emergency. Violence rises with the temperature, which knows no borders. Airstrikes detonate hospitals in countries whose names are burnt fossils: Syria, Yemen, Afghanistan, South Sudan, Iraq. When she crowned, my wife said it felt like rings of fire. Garment factories in Bangladesh char and collapse. Refugees self-immolate and at a detention center in the Nauru forests across Indonesia and are raised for palm oil plantations. Their plumes, like ashen ghosts of birds, flock to our descent, rib cages. When my daughter can't breathe, we give her asthma medication. But tonight we sing happy birthday and blow out the candles together. The smoke trembles as if we exhaled the same flammable wish. I invite you to join with me in singing hymn number 21 in your gray hymnal, For the Beauty of the Earth. Today I light our chalice in remembrance of all the people who've died because of climate change, all the people who've suffered because of heat and because of fire and because of Earth's disasters. May we hold them all in our blessed memory. And I light our green sanctuary candle for all the ways we strive to be a more sustainable congregation. Please say with me the Unison Affirmation as is written in your order of service. Love is the spirit of this church, and service is its law. To dwell together in peace, to seek the truth in freedom, to serve humanity in love is our covenant with each other and with God. We gather together to share our joys and concerns with hymn number 128 in our hymnal, For All That Is Our Life. As we share our joys and concerns today, we invite you to join in singing the verses. We will begin with verse 1, then pause for the reading of concerns. Then we will sing verse 3, pause for the reading of joys, and conclude by reading verse 2 and verse 4. You are invited to sing along as you wish.
For all that is our life, we sing our thanks and praise. For all life is a gift, which we are called to use, to build the common good, and make our own days glad.
We come together as a community to share our lives, our blessings, and our troubles. We believe that a sorrow shared is a burden lightened. Today we ask you to turn your thoughts and prayers to the family of Hannah Held, with great gratitude for her life and contributions to the Dedham community. May light perpetual shine upon her. With concern for our Mother Earth, with concern for our world, with concern for all those suffering with COVID-19. For these and all other concerns still unspoken, we pray.
For sorrow we must bear, for failures, pain, and loss, for each new thing we learn, for fearful hours that pass, we come with praise and thanks. For all that is our life.
We believe that a happiness shared is a joy magnified. Please join us in gratitude today for the joy of singing in the choir and the joy of hearing the beautiful result. The anticipated joy of seeing honest, principled, and decent leaders of our country sworn in a few days. Joy for the incredible resources now available to help me understand my whiteness. Joy for friends who tell it like it is. In appreciation for these and all the blessings in our lives, we come with praise and thanks.
For needs which others serve, for services we give, for work and its rewards, for hours of rest and love, we come with praise and thanks. For all that is our life, for all that is our life, we sing our thanks and praise.
I invite our children forward for our intergenerational message. We'll begin by centering ourselves, by ringing the bell and bringing that sound into our mind and our bodies and our spirits. Well, today I asked Grace to read you a story about Rachel Carson, who is an environmentalist. And maybe you've heard of her before, but if you haven't, I hope you pay close attention. Enjoy the story.
Hi, everyone. I'm here to read to you this week's intergenerational message. It is a book entitled Night Walk to the Sea, a story about Rachel Carson, Earth's Protector, by Deborah Wiles, pictures by Danielle Miares. It was bedtime in Rachel's cabin in the woods when thunder boomed and the storm roared in. "I'm not afraid," shouted Roger. "Crack!" the thunder answered. Roger's heart thumped in his chest. "I don't want to go to bed," he shouted. He stomped across the floor in his Godzilla pajamas. "I am a monster." "You are sometimes," Rachel agreed. She laughed and pretended to be a monster with Roger. Then, vzz, the lights went out. "I'm not scared," Roger shouted, but he was. We are safe inside," said Rachel. She lighted a lantern, then wrapped Roger's small body in the big blanket and sat with him in the window seat so they could watch the storm together. But Roger wiggled and twisted in Rachel's arms. "I want the lights to go on," he shouted. When the storm had worn itself out, Rachel said, "Let's go for a walk to the sea. We haven't done that in a long time." Rachel helped Roger with his rain jacket and boots. The boots were green with fangs on them. "Grrr," said Roger. "I'm not afraid." "That's good," said Rachel, "because there is nothing to be afraid of. The whole world is waiting for you." They walked past the cinnamon ferns and reindeer moss and the drip, drip, drip of glittery raindrops on the lips of the tiny leaves that were washed in moonlight. Their flashlights bobbed cones of yellow light ahead of them. "Listen to the voices of living things," said Rachel. A screech owl softly called to its mate from an old woodpecker hole. "Tremolo, tremolo, thrum, thrum, thrum." Little gray frogs in the nearby mud hole sang, "Croak, croak, croak." "Thanks for the rain." The crickets and the katydids started a band. "Buzz, chirp, chirp, whiz, zing, zing." Roger called back to them, "Grrr." Down the wooden stairs, past the laurel and the blueberry bushes, they stepped until they reached the salty shore. The roosting shorebirds flushed up and away, way, way. Roger tramped across the beach, crunch, crunch, crunch. He stomped the waves that bubbled and burbled around his monstery boots. "I will crush you," he shouted, while the ghost crabs tunneled ahead of his boots into the wet sand. Roger's heart banged in his chest harder and faster until he was all stomped out. "Come here," said Rachel in her softest voice. Roger came. "Turn off the light." Roger did. "Close your eyes." Roger closed them. And then, as the soft dark folded itself around them and the sea called to them, in and out, like a lullaby, Roger and Rachel breathed in the salty sea air together. "Now open your eyes," Rachel said. "Look." Roger blinked. "What is it?" he whispered. The sea was alive with moving light, blue and green and sparkling like diamonds. glittering like emeralds, alive and alive and alive. Everywhere, as far as Roger and Rachel could see, the sea was filled with luminous life. There are thousands of tiny organisms that live in the sea, Rachel explained, like little will-o'-the-wisps. The storm must have stirred them up, and they've turned their lights on. Look at this one, said Roger. A tiny creature was at their feet, blinking furiously in the foam, wet and frantic. He's trying to get to the lights in the sea. It's a firefly, said Rachel. He doesn't belong in the sea. He must have lost his way in the storm. Will he die? Asked Roger. Not if we save him, said Rachel. Quick, use your bucket. Roger scooped up the firefly along with sand and seaweed and salt water. Here, said Rachel, let's put him in my bucket so he can dry out. As carefully as the most gentle monster, Roger helped Rachel take the drowning firefly out of his waterlogged bucket and put it into her dry one. I'll carry it, he announced, and he did. They left the sea and picked their way past the juniper and thistles, climbed over the rocks, up the steps, and to the cabin in the woods. Roger's heart thrummed gently in his chest while he watched the firefly signal with its light, stronger and brighter, like a tiny firefly roar. He is so little, said Roger, and you are so big, said Rachel. I want to send him home now, said Roger, and that is what they did. They released the firefly, who was dry enough to fly again. They watched it flit and circle and wink away into the woods that were waiting for it. Roger rubbed his eyes. I am a monster who saves fireflies. You are indeed, said Rachel. And you are also a boy who loves all the creatures of the woods and sea. You are their brave protector. Sometimes I forget, whispered Roger. Rachel tucked Roger into bed. I will help you remember. I think that firefly was afraid, Roger said, sleepy now. All of us are afraid sometimes, answered Rachel. Grr, Roger whispered, which made them both laugh. And as the lights danced outside Roger's window, Rachel kissed him goodnight. Here's a note about Rachel Carson and the story. I sincerely believe it is not half so important to know as to feel, which is a quote from Rachel Carson in The Sense of Wonder. Rachel Louise Carson, who was born in 1907 and passed in 1964, grew up in Springdale, Pennsylvania, far from the sea. As a child, she rambled often with her mother, who encouraged her quiet wandering through the woods and fields near her home. She felt drawn to the nearby Allegheny River. Where did it lead? When she found a fossil shell while digging nearby. She wondered about the ocean creatures that had once lived there. What were they like? Rachel became a writer, an ecologist, and a marine scientist who wrote with great passion and respect about the natural world. She is the celebrated author of Silent Spring, one of the first books to document the deadly effects of widespread chemical pesticides on the earth and all living things. But her first love was the sea. In 1956, Rachel wrote a letter to her best friend, Dorothy Freeman, about a walk she had taken while at her cabin in Maine with her grown niece, Marjorie. They had gone to the sea after a late night storm to get the full wildness. We turned off our flashlight, the surface full of diamonds and emeralds. A firefly was going by, his lamp blinking. He was flying so low over the water, he was soon in trouble, and we saw his light flashing urgently as he was rolled around in the wet sand. You can guess the rest. Also in 1956, Rachel wrote a piece for Women's Home Companion magazine called Help Your Child to Wonder, which later became her book, The Sense of Wonder, published in 1965. The heartfelt sentiments she shared about children and the natural world, which she described in rich detail, began with a walk on the beach with her young grandnephew and adopted son, Roger, in the early 1950s. I combined that moment with the adventure Rachel described in her letter to Dorothy and found my own sense of wonder in that beautiful night scene of bioluminescence and the struggling firefly. All these twinklings became my inspiration for a night walk to the sea. My hope is that you, like Rachel and Roger, will be filled with a sense of wonder when you are outside, in nature, by the sea, in the mountains, among the forests, in your backyard, or wherever you find yourself among the creatures of earth who depend on us for their survival. You can read and learn much more about Rachel Carson in rachelcarson.org.
I invite you into a time of prayer or meditation, as is your practice. We begin by breathing in peace and breathing out love. Breathing in peace and breathing out love. Breathing in peace and breathing out love. Let us be grateful for all the silences in our lives, for with them we may more completely experience the sound. Amen. Our first reading today is an excerpt from The Green Collar Economy by Van Jones. At the end of the 1970s, local parents discovered a toxic chemical dump buried underneath Love Canal, Niagara Falls, New York. Leaking underground, waste was said to be causing a myriad of nervous disorders, miscarriages, and birth defects in more than half of the children born in the area between 1974 and 1978. The highly publicized tragedy led Congress to pass the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation and Liability Act, better known as the Superfund Law. Superfund assessed a tax on petroleum and chemical industries to create a fund for cleaning up abandoned or uncontrolled hazardous waste sites. Yet despite the area's multitude gains, particularly in the domain of legislation, this second wave of U.S. environmentalism had its disappointing aspects as well. And once again, the culprits were race, class, and power. The movement to better regulate industrial society was, in its origins, almost entirely the purview of the affluent and white. As a result, it failed to see the toxic pollution that was concentrating in communities of poor and brown-skinned people. Even after the major environmental laws were passed, in fact, some people of color began to wonder if white polluters and white environmentalists were unconsciously collaborating. At times, it seemed that both groups were willing to see the worst polluters and foulest dumps steered into Black, Latino, Asian, and poor neighborhoods. These unjust and unequal outcomes prompted activists representing both people of color and low-income communities to speak out forcefully. In the 1980s, a new movement was born to combat what its leaders called environmental racism. Those leaders said, in essence, regulate pollution, yes, but do it with equity. Do it fairly. Don't make Black and brown and poor children bear a disproportionate burden of asthma and cancer. Regulate, yes, but do it justly. Their battle cry marked the beginning of a serious corrective movement, insisting that the regulatory wave protect all people equally. And that corrective movement has now become a force in its own right. It is called the Movement for Environmental Justice. I invite you to relax into our anthem, Adoration by Florence B. Price, performed by Susan Jensen on violin. Thank you, Susan. Our second reading is I'm a Black Climate Expert. Racism Derails Our Efforts to Save the Planet by Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson in the Washington Post, published June 3rd, 2020. Toni Morrison said it best in a 1975 speech. The very serious function of racism is distraction. It keeps you from doing your work. It keeps you explaining over and over again your reason for being. As a marine biologist and policy nerd, building community around climate solution is my life's work. But I'm also a Black person in the United States of America. I work on one existential crisis, but these days I can't concentrate because of another. The sheer magnitude of transforming our energy, transportation, building, and food systems within a decade while striving to reach net zero greenhouse gas emissions shortly thereafter is already overwhelming, and Black Americans are disproportionately more likely than whites to be concerned about and affected by the climate crisis. But the many manifestations of structural racism, mass incarceration, and state violence mean environmental issues are only a few lines on a long tally of threats. How can we expect Black Americans to focus on climate when we are at risk on our streets, in our communities, and even within our own homes? How can people of color effectively lead their communities on climate solutions when faced with pervasive and life-shortening racism. Even at its most benign, racism is incredibly time-consuming. Black people don't want to be protesting for our basic rights to live and breathe. We don't want to be constantly justify our existence. Racism, injustice, and police brutality are awful on their own, but are additionally pernicious because of the brain power and creative hours they steal from us. I think one Black friend of mine who wanted to be an astronomer but gave up that dream because organizing for social justice was more pressing. Consider the discoveries not made, the books not written, the ecosystems not protected, the art not created, the gardens not tended. I invite you to enjoy with me hymn number 117, O Light of Life That Lives in Us. I invite you to sing with me hymn number 117, O Light of Life That Lives in Us. I actually know this is a very sad hymn that I have made us sing quite often recently, partially because it's public domain and partially because I think it speaks loudly to the times we live in. Ministers of more conservative congregations who do not ascribe to the science of climate change ponder if environmental justice is really a religious matter. Thankfully, as a Unitarian Universalist who pledges to affirm and promote the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part, we all understand that all things on this earth are connected and we are a part of them. As such, how the earth is changing is not only a religious or spiritual matter, it is central to our health and well-being as a planet. Not only that, but pollution and areas of pulsating electricity continually being placed closest to the most disenfranchised neighborhoods of our country has significantly reduced the life expectancy of the poor and Black and brown-skinned people in our world. If treating the poor poorly is not a religious mandate for change, I don't know what is. Back when I stood with my colleagues to protest the high-speed natural gas pipeline that now goes through Dedham, I did so because much of that pipeline passes by homes of renters who did not receive notice of the proposed pipeline, yet would be the greatest at risk when and if it were to explode. Also, in addition to being in one of the most densely populated residential neighborhoods, the metering and regulation station for this pipeline was proposed to sit directly across the street from an active blasting zone, which it does. I stood with other religious professionals. We sang songs and marched. I even wrote a eulogy for all of those who were dying that summer due to the rising heat, while some of my colleagues lay down in the long pits that were being dug for the pipeline that looked an awfully lot like the long pits that were being dug as mass graves for those dying in the Middle East. We can no longer turn a blind eye to the way our actions create reactions that affect others. One of my seminary professors suggested that this was the true original sin, how our actions create reactions around the world. When I turn on the heat or air conditioning, my fossil fuel usage creates a hole in the ozone layer that endangers someone else. The spiritual question is, how do we reconcile this reality with our daily lives? The call for environmental justice is about restoring equity so that every human, no matter their birth location, has the similar chances for longevity. In a 2018 study by the Environmental Protection Agency, the National Center for Environmental Assessment showed that people of color are much more likely to live near environmental wastelands and thus breathe polluted air. Specifically, the study finds that people in poverty are exposed to more particulate matter than their wealthier counterparts. The danger of this is evidenced in the 35% of children with black and brown skin having been diagnosed with asthma compared to the 8% of white children. And the fact that people with black and brown skin are 4 times more likely to die as a result of an asthma attack than their white counterparts. Do you remember right when the quarantine first hit and how after about a week it got so quiet you could almost hear, even in our suburban town, the music of wood nymphs hopping from branch to branch and satyrs blowing their flutes? I exaggerate, of course, but it was rather quiet. In many ways, socioeconomically privileged people, predominantly white citizens like myself, who have access to computers and space to move around, we could easily see the secondary benefits of the quarantine, while people who live in or below the poverty level, predominantly black and brown citizens, were more likely to contract COVID-19 because of the higher risk of asthma and lack of clean air in their neighborhoods. They also could not access education right away because many did not have access to computers or adequate internet, or even a quiet place to study. I asked Grace to read the children's story about the walk in the woods today because I wanted to juxtapose a walk in fresh air, even in the darkness or in the light, with a city walk near factories and metering stations and energy plants. To restore environmental equity, we are going to have to find new and improved ways to offer up clean air and clean water and connection to nature for all people, regardless of the location of their birth or the fiscal resources or the color of their skin. To make our environment truly equitable for all, we must also reduce our dependence on fossil fuels. I hope the new administration will be more willing to make this a mandate than our current one has been. But we will have to be vigilant in asking for alternatives and demanding that the old infrastructure are dispersed in responsible ways. Just last Thursday, Governor Baker vetoed a climate bill that would have made Massachusetts net neutral before 2050, following the deadlines set by the Climate Accord. In doing so, Baker cited housing concerns, saying that the restrictions would stymie construction. But I ask you, if we are really going to make the changes necessary to make cleaner air for all, don't you think we're all going to have to feel the pinch in some way or another? For us to save the planet, we must reduce our carbon footprint. There is no easy way to do that. True economic justice will require us to make accommodations. Perhaps most importantly, corporate greed will need to be quelled if we're ever going to make an equitable climate for all. This is going to require our government to take a strong hand, not a wimpy one, when it comes to environmental change. And this will require each of us as citizens to persistently express our views to our elected officials. We must also do everything in our power to provide clean air and clean water to children in our cities, which will include summer camp scholarships and opportunities to enjoy nature the way the child in our intergenerational message was able to. Environmentalist Rachel Carson, after whom our intergenerational message was modeled, is quoted as saying, "The more clearly we can focus our attention on the wonders and realities of the universe about us, the less taste we shall have for destruction." So perhaps the nature hikes should not be reserved for children, but regulated for heads of corporations who bumble through production without a care for the health and well-being of the communities that surround them. I often wonder how the CEO of Spectra would have felt if he ever had to really stand for just a few minutes across from the active blasting zone in West Roxbury, where they put the metering and regulation station for the high-speed natural gas pipeline that runs through Dedham. How differently he might have felt if he'd had to walk around the neighborhoods and knock on the doors of the renters and those in senior living facilities who lived beside the pipeline, introduce himself, tell them about his company and the plan, and ask for the approval of these residents face to face. It is easy to imagine the CEO of Spectra to be like the satyr, half horse and half man, who dances around to his own music, drinking and not paying attention to any of the needs or concerns of real people affected by his actions. But satyrs are mythical creatures, and CEOs of companies who have knowingly destroyed our environment are real people and should be held accountable for the damage that they do. If we are ever going to restore environmental equity, we are going to have to feel some discomfort and take responsibility for our actions and do things differently. All of us. I invite you to join with me in singing hymn number 122, Sound Over All Water. And let us fix our steps, so we stagger not in the uneven motions of this world, but go steadily on our way, neither centering our journey by the weather we meet, or turning aside from anything that might befall us. Amen. And please join me for Zoom Social Hour.